With me in this episode is Chris Simkins. Chris is an ex-founder of two organizations, first Laconia, which is a legal consulting firm, and then Chainsec, which was a technology firm designed to continue helping organizations with the CFIUS process, spelled CFIUS, which is required for foreign investment in the United States for certain transactions. After these experiences on the more legal side of things, Chris decided to move to API security. And now with Corsha, he's implementing multi-factor authentication for APIs to help organizations further secure that part of their ecosystem. They recently raised their Series A, which they just announced in April, which is a strong indicator of the traction that they're seeing in this space and that more and more organizations are starting to recognize this as a potential avenue for further improving their organization's security posture. Before we get into the episode, a quick note from our sponsor, rThreat. rThreat is the one and only zero trust validation platform that lets your organization ensure that your zero trust controls are working effectively. rThreat uses real malicious scripts, that's right, real malicious scripts in a secure testing environment to make sure that your organization can actually detect, prevent, and respond to real-world like attacks. Now, as tool sprawl continues in security organization, it becomes more and more important to actually verify that these tools are doing what they're supposed to in preventing, detecting, and responding to these types of events. That's exactly what rThreat is doing. Now, they have several customers already, and they're looking to fill out the remainder of a seed round, which they already have half committed. They're looking for that lead investor, and if you're interested, you can reach out at hugo.sanchez@rthreat.com, and I'll include a link to that email address down in the episode description. Let's get to it. Chris, thanks for coming on the show.
Very happy to be here. I appreciate the invite.
Yeah. So we'll definitely get to Corsha. As we've talked about previously, when I first heard about it, I just thought, this has really interesting ramifications, and I have no idea how this works. So I want to give you the chance to really explain that, and I'll get to ask some of the dumb questions that hopefully our listeners will benefit from. But before we get there, there's kind of two key pieces of your background that I want to touch on. The first is Laconia, and it's labeled as a law firm and consulting firm. So when I first saw that you were a kind of founder and managing partner at Laconia, I was thinking that maybe you had this closet law background that you'd pivoted away from. But what was the story there? How did that get started?
Yeah, it's a good question. I am, and I apologize to everybody. I'm a lawyer. Nobody likes the lawyers, but I am a lawyer by training. Yeah, so I have the legal background, and after doing big firm law practice, I went into the Justice Department, and this is the segue into Laconia. But I joined the Justice Department in what was called the Counterespionage group, and so what we did was working with the intelligence community and law enforcement. So I worked with FBI and CIA and NSA and others. We would identify spies working in the United States, being recruited here and going out, or those coming in. And a lot of that was both the human side and the technical side, and then we would investigate and in some cases prosecute. And then and then as an adjunct to that, I was asked to be the seat for the Justice Department on a government committee. It's called CFIUS, Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. And what that is it sounds like a disease, but it's actually just this committee, CFIUS. And they look at foreign acquisitions of U.S. companies. And so the U.S. government can stop those if it touches national security, or just let them through. But often if they are sensitive companies, then the U.S. government negotiates and asks for concessions that will protect national security interests, and that's often technology and data. Think telecommunications and computers and that kind of stuff. So I became the primary negotiator for the committee, and then I would work with FBI, CIA, NSA, DoD, DHS, and others, and we would put together these kind of technical mitigation programs. And some public ones I can talk about are when Alcatel bought Lucent. I negotiated the ground rules for Alcatel to buy Lucent, and when IBM sold some of its divisions to Lenovo, those kind of things. So when I leave government, those are skills that I wanted to explore, and that led to Laconia.
Interesting. Okay. And I do want to touch on that counter espionage piece a little bit more, just because, again, that idea is very fascinating to me. One of the things that I'd heard recently, which had never really occurred to me previously, is this idea that every major tech company in the US, so if you think about like FANG, for example, or I guess, I don't know what that new acronym is with Meta, but if you think about those major tech companies, the idea is all of them have some spy installed from another country. And so, I mean, who's to say for each of these companies which countries are being represented in those companies? But based on your experience, is that something that you found really that common, where there are all of these spies across U.S. companies, or is that a little bit more of a wives' tale?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's somewhere in between. So
Sure.
it's not that every company has that, but every country in the world, especially the big ones, and us included here in the United States,
Yeah.
have realized that one of the best ways to get into another country, understand what it's about, collect information, not necessarily even classified information, but just information,
Sure.
is to embed with companies, and particularly companies that are tech companies that have the ability to, uh, uh, get a wide view of data. There's that effort. It's really tough for, say, if you had a spy from another country to come into Google and somehow affect Google. That's
Sure.
a tough thing. But I will tell you that what happens and is more prevalent is are companies around the world agreeing to cooperate with their home government to do technology things that collect information. And that happens, and everybody does it to each other, and everybody tries to catch each other at it.
And what's a specific example of that? I mean, I think if I'm following correctly, it's the idea of pulling information to the government from like US companies, right? So it'd be the US government pulling information from US companies in order to have better insight into activity across the globe or activity of its citizens. Am I largely on the right track there?
Yeah, you are. And so and every country's ecosystem is different in terms of how willing the companies are to play game with their
Yep.
government, or in some ways be forced. So in China, if you're a Chinese company, because of just their government regime, if the Chinese government comes to a big tech company, Tencent, or
Sure.
you name it, and I'm not speaking because I know about Tencent. I'm just saying the paradigm is, so, and
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
like, give us your customer data, help us build social graphs, that kind of stuff. That's going to happen.
Hmm.
Here in the United States, the U.S. government asks for help from some companies when they're not to operate here in the United States, but when they go outside the United States, it can ask commercial tech companies to provide data, provide access, that kind of thing. And the U.S. government does less of it than some other countries, but does it fairly regularly.
Interesting. I mean, one thing that comes to mind for me is it feels like over the last, I don't know, 5 years or so, roughly, consumers have become more aware of this point, and certain companies have been able to actually build their brand reputations by taking a hard stand against that.
Mm-hmm.
So it'll be interesting to see how that continues over time and whether more companies follow along in the steps of like WhatsApp, for example, where we say, hey, there are no exceptions, no one will have access to your data. And again, who knows kind of behind the scenes how true that really is. But at least from a branding standpoint, it sounds good. And I think consumers resonate with that a bit more.
Yeah, I think all consumers, we as people don't like the idea of anyone taking our information. I think you're right. That's a good go-to-market strategy. It is. I will tell you, it's not always true. Uh,
Yeah.
well, and more pointedly, it's not even that companies, and I will tell you, this spawned ultimately some of these ideas bleed into the theories behind Corsha, which we'll get
Hmm.
to. But um, in all countries, and including in the United States, companies can say, "Yeah, I'm not going to cooperate with the government. I'm going to protect my customers' information. I'm not going to include backdoors," and they can mean it. Except there are some industries like telecommunications where they're actually required to have that capability by law in the United States. And it's so that if FBI or law enforcement is investigating not just espionage or terrorism, but crime, the whole notion of wiretaps or taking internet data or browsing data or email, companies are actually required to provide that if they're given an order from the government to do it. So they all do it.
Yeah, makes sense. And to your point, right, I'm sure the government has some hand in all of these companies. So let's keep moving. I want to get to Corsha here, but before we get there, let's talk about ChainSec. So you were working at Laconia, you were having the hand with CFIUS, you were helping these decision makers through the acquisition process, and then you started ChainSec. How did that come about, and what was ChainSec really trying to accomplish?
Yeah, good questions. So when I came out of government, I did Laconia, and I did both legal and consulting stuff where I would advise companies actually on their process back into government. So if a company is going to go through the CFIUS process, I would advise them. And then the legal side is that I do unique legal things to help companies in that sphere. So ChainSec was the next evolution. We're doing consulting, looking at companies, and then what we realize is that most of the companies, like if a foreign company is buying a U.S. company and they're going through that process, the U.S. government, and I used to be that guy who would say, all right, you can do your acquisition, but you're going to have to do these technical implementations to keep data in the United States, or you need to ensure to us that your source code cannot be exposed to somebody who may have malicious intent. And in a global environment where where product development is global today, then there are actually technical things along the way, and then the corollary to that is a big bank in the United States or the government itself may say, okay, I'm going to buy this technology solution from a provider. I want that provider that vendor to assure me that from a supply chain perspective, nothing's happened. And so ChainSec was a professional services firm where I went from consulting in Laconia to more professional services with a technology edge, where we were actually doing some of those forensics, and we were helping build the technical security processes to help companies have a good story about the security of their products.
Got it. So kind of I think you put it well, right? The evolution of Laconia and saying, hey, we have a hand in this process from a strategic standpoint. Part of that strategic recommendation is to make sure that you have the technical controls in place that allow you to kind of move forward with that process. You said, well, hey, why don't we start ChainSec to actually help them implement these controls? We know what it takes, and we can help them get to that desired end state.
Yep, that's exactly it.
Awesome. So my understanding is Corsha does not have a tie back into CFIUS specifically, right? When I think of Corsha, the idea is MFA for APIs. And again, I'll let you elaborate on what that really means. But what was it like to pivot out of this whole CFIUS focused just area of operations to something completely different? How did Corsha come about?
Yep. Yeah, great question. So as I was marching along from being on the government side to doing things and collecting information, to consulting about it, to looking at the security around the technology itself and chain, had this epiphany. And I wasn't working with my co-founder at the time, but eventually we came together. But it was this epiphany that being on both sides, there really is no way to stop a concerted state actor from stealing information. There's not. I mean, nobody plays offense well enough, or nobody plays defense well enough to stop the best offense. And the nation states are the biggest ones, but the hackers are getting super effective, I would say. And it's not just being tricky or social engineering like phishing and other things. There are some just brute force things that are really tough to do. And if you get personal information about people, it's really tough to build your wall. And so And at the time that I was in Chain and thinking about some of these problems, one of the biggest problems was the idea of simply stealing credentials that allow you
Hmm.
to get in. And look at the username and password problem. There is no way to stop the theft of those. It happens over and over again. And so that was the genesis of thinking, let's build something that can make, and we were focused on credentials. Let's do something to make a stolen credential unusable. If you can't stop it from being stolen, make it unusable.
Hmm. Okay. And
And
so,
that's Corsha.
right. So let's drill into that a little bit further, right? Because as you're talking through that example, my first idea is okay, user credentials, right? And you specifically
Mm-hmm.
allude to username and password combinations.
Yeah.
How did you get to machine credentials as opposed to user credentials?
Yeah, great question. So we first were thinking about actually user credentials when we started the company, and
Okay.
we had a different name at the very beginning. We were a different name for about 3 months, and then we became Corsha. But the idea was the multi-factor authentication. Just thinking about users like you and I, we log into our bank account or social media or your work account or something, and you often will use some sort of username and a password, and those credentials, you can think of it as kind of the bearer model. If it's a valid username and password, if someone has that and they're valid, they can use it from anywhere. um,
Sure.
and that's part of what was the problem. So industry came along and created this notion of multi-factor authentication. And what that does is, we get that security code texted to us or it comes off your app or something when you're logging in, and it doesn't change the username and password itself. What it means is that they can only be used from that juncture where you get that security code. That's
Right.
the purpose of multi-factor. So it creates a geographic location, so to speak, or a physical location for the use of credentials, because it has to be on that device. So we were looking at that, and we were thinking, that's been successful in at least slowing the use of stolen credentials for humans.
Yep.
But the next evolution was, but really humans hate that process. I mean, like, we hate it. I mean, and 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 typically, if we're going to tolerate it, we do it because somebody makes us, and then we do it at the first login, and then we don't want to be bothered again. And so we started thinking about, how do we move that process of multi-factor authentication into the device ecosystem? So maybe you don't have to have the human be involved. And I will tell you, the other part of this is the private information. So even at that time, a lot of people were thinking about this problem of forcing the human to be involved in that, and maybe there's a different way. Um,
Hmm.
a lot of companies, both vendors and also just organically, like in some of the big banks, they were doing things that were behavioral. So yeah, you don't have to have that code sent to you to log in, but we're going to monitor your device, and we're going to check every website you visited. We're going to check your geolocation. We're going to fingerprint you, and then we'll know it's you, and then you don't have to do that stuff. The
Right.
problem is governments take that information, or they steal that from the vendors. They steal that personal information, and then they can wreak havoc. So we wanted to move it to the device, remove the human, not use personal information, and that was the genesis of a business case and the technology for Corsha.
Hmm. So if I'm understanding that last piece right, you're saying that collecting the kind of behavioral analytics on a given user profile is in some ways vulnerable, because if a nation state attacker is able to access those systems and grab those credentials in the first place, then they're also probably able to grab those behavioral analytics information and data points, and then still go ahead and replicate those different conditions so they can use the account. Am I understanding that right?
Exactly. In fact, what I learned in ChainSec, as I was helping actually a lot of cybersecurity vendors feel like they were secure in their product development that they then would sell, is that many of the cybersecurity vendors especially in Silicon Valley, have themselves become the target of hackers because they contain information about their customers. And
Hmm.
so in this effort of trying to make their customer more secure and do it seamlessly, now they're in possession of actually customer information or device information. The RSA breach was one of those where somebody breached a device to seed table, and then they opened up all the RSA
Hmm.
protected devices. And so that was part of us saying, we don't want to ever touch, need, or hold any of that information. So let's have this secure authentication model that doesn't have to rely on
Interesting. Okay, so we have these different problems outlined, right? Credentials are very easily to be stolen.
it. Yeah.
The underlying behavioral analytics that some of these institutions were using is not fully effective and actually giving that additional layer of security. MFA prompts exist, but you have to get users to turn them on in the first place, and that's really only easy when it's required. That's changing more over time as well. But what then did the Corsha solution actually look like to address all these challenges?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the initial thought was to flip the security paradigm on its head a little bit, because um, we knew we were going to push it into the device. So the device itself, the phone, the smartphone, the laptop, something like that. That's where the action was going to happen. And as long as this notion of multi-factor authentication or secure authentication originated from a central authority that it would push down these codes to the devices or somehow have to interact with the devices, we knew that that link of the push down from central to the device was part of that problem. So we flipped it on its head, and we created this notion of being able to deploy on the device itself first. So we securely deploy onto the device. We
Hmm.
kind of seed the device as a way to think of it. As soon as you seed it, that seeding is no longer relevant, and we give the device a secure heartbeat, so that
Hmm.
the identity of that device is defined by this a heartbeat, small pieces of cryptographic information that are written on the device and
Sure.
then streamed into a secure holding center. So it's coming from the device in rather than from a central repository to the device. So you can
And
think
so,
of it as an ecosystem of heartbeats.
and what kind of devices are we really talking about here? And I think
Yeah.
this will become more clear as we talk about the rest of this context, right? But are we
Yeah.
talking about like any end user's mobile phone that might be making API requests to like a publicly available endpoint? Or is this something more like a backend server that might be making an API call to the private API in a corporate environment?
Yeah, great question. And so and the answer to that is a bit of our evolution at Corsha. So
Hmm.
when we had this idea, let's we had the technology idea. We're going to use devices, and at first we were focused on phones and laptops. The device used by the human, and probably primarily we were focused on an enterprise environment to begin
Sure.
with, because that's where the security was going to be the most important, and our customer would be the enterprise. And so we raised some seed money. We started developing, and we'd been going for a little while, and was seeing some interest, but our development actually was going really well.
Hmm.
It was at that point that we realized the notion of human security, the user security, had really been addressed by a lot of companies. Excuse me. And we realized that there was a market opportunity when you start thinking of machines. So your question is, what machines? Well, the real machines that were behind the curve, who hadn't really received the security authentication, it wasn't the mobile device, it was the machines or endpoints that were deeper in a network. And so when we started thinking about business ecosystems, if I'm a big enterprise and I have important data of any sort, and I'm in a hybrid cloud environment or a multi-cloud environment, or I've got a microservices architecture, I've got a bunch of machines that talk to one another, probably by APIs. Probably the biggest bulk of the data movement in my enterprise is in purely automated processes that a human might initiate it, but then there's not a human involved anymore.
Sure.
And it could be moving within my enterprise. It could be moving between my platforms. It could move between me and partner organizations, a partner, a vendor, something like that. And those machines, even today, most of the world is still kind of back in the old username and password mode. If you rewind humans
Sure.
20 years, it's just the human name and the user and password, and there's not multi-factor authentication. In today's environment, most of those machine connections are protected by a key or a token or a SWIFT,
Right.
and it's simply a complicated password, and they're being stolen. So we thought that's the use case. So the machine that we protect, or that user we protect, is actually just an automated machine endpoint.
Got it. So when we think about the scope of Corsha and this kind of segment of API security, we're looking at presumably mostly private APIs, because if it was a public
Yes.
API, then there'd be no need to kind of restrict it to these corporate devices.
Yes.
So private APIs that are being accessed by internal corporate systems, and then the idea is assigning these different heartbeats to your different corporate devices that need to be accessing those corresponding APIs to then authenticate that these devices that are accessing your internal APIs are actually validated as legitimate and resources of the corporate environment.
Yep, that's a great way to put it. If I'm a big enterprise and I've got a footprint that's big, and say I'm in cloud and I've got some legacy systems, every one of those the repositories of data all are going to have essentially an endpoint with an identity, and for every API service that they may move through, we're going to protect that movement of data to that API service with our platform, and that's the API security play that we have. You're right. I mean, publicly facing APIs, if they're just out on the internet or something, and they're anybody in the world can go after them, that's not where we are right now. And there are other API security players who are doing very well and have approaches to that. We're probably a pretty good partner to them. Protect it, come to the edge. We're inside the perimeter.
So one of the things that this makes me think about is some of the secrets management tools that exist today, right? And this idea of being able to dynamically provision some of these essentially fancy passwords, like you mentioned, right? If you think about like an API key or a token or a certificate, dynamically permission those for an individual API call, so those aren't standing permissions. What's really the key issue with that approach that Corsha is taking? Or maybe are those both legitimate solutions and secrets management solutions are just much more cumbersome to set up within an environment?
Yeah, it's a great question. If you could deploy mutual TLS on every endpoint, have perfect hygiene, where you're rotating those keys at, you deployed them, it's a 1-for-1, so you only put the PKI information in one and only one juncture and then rotate them, there'd be a lot of security, and then maybe there's less need for us. But that's actually not what's happening. Even I mean, it's just, and that's not a knock on people. The more complex an environment gets, the more endpoints you have, the more you're spinning up and down. The Kubernetes world where you're auto scaling up and down. You have the work to maintain good hygiene, even in a good secrets management environment with good secrets management tools, ends up spraying credentials. They get sprayed across different things. It's in this config file. It's in that CI/CD system. It's in this. It's in this. It's in this. And even the solutions where they wait and essentially ask for the credential at the time of the call, they are open to a man-in-the-middle attack, because someone can grab the movement of that credential from when it comes to the repository, and that's no different than the username password attacks that are man-in-the-middle.
Got it.
So we're trying to address.
Yeah, one specific example that's coming to mind for me, right, is whenever I tell people about secrets management, or I'm having those conversations, they think, okay, well, now you have one centralized repository where all your secrets are being created, right? And these vendors obviously aren't stupid. They're putting in all the appropriate measures to make sure that those vaults are as secure as possible.
Yeah.
But in the kind of worst case scenario that maybe we're talking about here, right? If that vault was compromised and an attacker was able to access all the secrets that were in a vault, then Corsha would presumably still protect those credentials from being misused because it wouldn't be a legitimate verified device within the network, right? So again, kind of that MFA idea.
That's exactly it. And right now we think of ourselves as a layered approach. So if you're using a vault, for example, we don't tell any enterprise to stop using the vault. And a lot of those credentials actually have a lot of authorization um, uh, um, functionality in those credentials. So if you need to have scope of authorization, still use them. Use a vault, manage them that way. That's great. But yeah, the Corsha solution is layered on top. And what we say is, even if you don't have great hygiene or you don't want to worry about hygiene, use the vault. Uh, we will protect it even if it's stolen. So if somebody gets in the middle, no sweat. You're not going to get compromised.
Got it. Got it. So thinking back to this kind of heartbeat idea a little bit further, right? Is there any risk of like replicating one of these heartbeats for one of the devices, right? Because then ultimately, if you're able to impersonate a device that's presumably validated, then maybe you get around that. And I'm sure that's something your team's thought about. So how have you addressed that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and that's a question we hope people ask because it means they're thinking about how the attack could come in.
Nice, pass the test.
Yeah, so that's great. So the way and maybe clicking down one more level into how it
Sure.
works. So we push a binary onto all the endpoints, and we hook into a CI/CD system so that it's easy. This is just automated, or if you want, we can go in at the code level, but we don't require code change.
Sure.
But ultimately, we've got a binary on all your authorized endpoints. They when we do the heartbeat, and we call this little binary an authenticator. We put an authenticator on every endpoint. It writes these little binary or these little cryptographic codes, and it's just a small code structure that is, it's simplifying. It's just a random code based on some entropy and some inputs. When that heart beats, so to speak, it streams that beat to a distributed ledger network, which is enterprise type blockchain technology. It's not cryptocurrency blockchain. It's one that can be specific to the enterprise, and we built it on an open source project written by IBM, and then we
Cool.
orchestrated it on Kubernetes. So it's really pretty slick, actually.
Awesome.
So the heartbeat goes from the device, streams to the DLN, and then is recorded in blockchain fashion. And so device then, what you can configure it on minutes or hours or days, whatever. The next heartbeat is written and streamed, and each one is cryptographically linked to the next. So every heartbeat is built on the previous one, and it's recorded in this ledger. So your question is, what would happen if somebody just steals that authenticator, or these are cloud workloads? Let's say they just mirror it. So now there are two of them. They look exactly the same, and one's owned by the good guy and one's owned by the bad guy.
Right.
Yeah. So because of the way we're using the ledger, they would both have to try to write to the same ledger account for that heartbeat, and we would see the collision. And this is happening ongoing even between API calls. So this heartbeat it's just ongoing, and it's the identity for that endpoint. We have this management console, see all your heartbeats, you can see all your machines, but you'll see the collisions, and it also means that you can't. The way we construct the MFA credential is that we take a handful of those heartbeats, the last few, on the endpoint, and then the endpoint does some magic and creates a one-time use MFA credential based on the heartbeats. And so when the API call comes in, we have a proxy that sits in front of the API. It grabs our one-time use credential and then goes and asks the DLN, is this consistent with the identity that's come from this machine? If it is, it comes through. If it's not, it's blocked. But in that way, we have this one-for-one correlation so that you can't get in the middle and steal one of those heartbeats. It's not good enough. You can't replicate. So that's part of our security story.
Interesting. Yeah, it's honestly awesome to hear just a very kind of like private market use of blockchain? Because I feel like that's touted so much in different
Yeah.
pitch decks or just thrown around, obviously, in all the different Web3 projects today. But that sounds like a very like applicable use case for this kind of blockchain idea and applying it to some of these other concepts. So I think it'll be awesome to see how that continues to evolve over time. One of the other things that came to mind as we talked about that, right, is you mentioned the idea of detecting a collision. So if two different devices are sending the same heartbeat and those are sending at the same time, then the Corsha platform will be able to say, hey, there's a collision here. Obviously, something is not legitimate because we can't have two of you. What if, again, maybe this is diving too deep into theory, but I'm really curious. What if you were able to turn off the heartbeat on the original device and start a heartbeat on a new device? Then you're no longer showing a collision. Presumably, you're maintaining that ledger because you're able to send like the past transactions that came along from that device. And again, we're getting into a pretty convoluted example, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So when we see a pause, let's say that there's a pause in one or the other, you know, even if it's not a replication, but there's a pause in the stream that we're expecting it on a particular time period. Uh, the distributed ledger can tell the machine, hey, I need a new heartbeat from you. I need a new heartbeat from you. And so if there and the attack you're talking about, it would be very orchestrated, highly orchestrated attack.
Yeah.
You know, so I mirror one. It's got the exact same information. I turn off the first one, and in our rotation and the hey, give me a new credential or give me a new heartbeat, it would go to the original machine, not the new one. And there's some IP behind that and some tricks about how we would do that. But it would be difficult for them to do that. And I will say too that no system is perfect, and we
Yeah.
would never say that we're perfect. If the attack is sophisticated enough to turn off the API in the first one and clone, actually the better attack then is just to own that first one, own that machine.
Sure.
and then once the machine itself is owned, that's a difficult one. We have some analytics that we could do to spot that, but that would be the better attack rather than the other.
Yeah, that's a good point. And certainly if the machine is owned, then you have bigger problems to worry about than leaking the credentials to that API. So
That's
no,
right.
I appreciate your patience with me and just diving down that rabbit hole. But it was interesting to hear how all those ideas have been addressed. So let's talk a little bit more about just kind of the state of Corsha right now, right?
Mm-hmm.
You raised your Series A in the beginning of April, so congratulations.
Thank you.
I'm sure a big part of this, again, like we discussed, there's a lot to unpack with this technology. It's a lot to digest, and at least to me, it feels like a new kind of security concept as we think about API communication. So I'm sure a big focus of the team right now is just being able to tell that story to more folks. What have you found is kind of creating the most traction in getting people to understand this idea of MFA for APIs?
Great question. Yeah, you're exactly right. Is that we are API security, but we're quite different from most in the space. And so when we tell our story, we're trying to figure out, what's the way to help someone understand the story, because most enterprises who have an internal API ecosystem like this, or sharing data through APIs with partners, recognize the security vulnerability. And we find that over and over again. If you talk to them about secrets management and the opportunity to be exploited and the consequences to the enterprise, almost everyone's going, yeah, that's that. Got to do something about that.
Right.
So when we are explaining how we do it, it's not helpful to just say we're API security, because different ways to think about it. What we say is that we are identity and access management for APIs. And what we're trying to do is frame that in terms that everybody understands kind of what that means in the human world. There is identity. There has to be affirmative identity of that user. And then there has to be secure authentication to confirm that identity. That's exactly what we're doing. And We do the dynamic identity coupled with the MFA. And so we think that that's resonating. When we say that to folks, it resonates. Our first customer, which is, we did it backwards compared to most cybersecurity companies, is most cybersecurity companies go into the enterprise markets and they try to find their way into gov, mostly because
Sure.
gov is viewed as hard, and but it turns out the U.S. government's the biggest cybersecurity innovator and buyer in the world.
Yeah.
That's where we started, and in part because of our background. We're in the DC area, we know gov, and so we're growing in that. Gov's our biggest customer, and we're growing in that space. And now we're moving out in the enterprise space with the API security. But this notion of identity and access management, Gov has picked that up right away. They totally get that, and it comports well with zero trust requirements that are
Definitely
everywhere. And I will tell you, I wish that it was like somehow planned, or we had this foresight. We were just lucky a little bit, and that is that the zero trust standards that have been pushed out by DoD and NIST and CISA and others, they were prescient enough to recognize in kind of the identity and authentication part of zero trust is that there are human users and there are non-human users in networks. And that in true DoD fashion, Defense Department, they call them non-person entities, NPEs, which is a fancy way of saying machines.
Yeah.
So when we say we are identity and access management for the non-person entities, and there are others who do identity and access management for the human users, that seems to resonate.
Right. And I'm sure there's something to be said as well, right? That as secrets management as a concept continues to grow, telling that story of identity and access management for machine credentials will gain more traction in saying, hey, secrets management tools are doing it this way, Corsha is doing it this way, and providing that additional layer of defense on top of it. So I think there's probably a lot of people trying to tell that same story in terms of the problem set and some of the solution options. And I'm sure that helps in building that Corsha narrative as well. So, I mean, thinking ahead, right, we've talked about, hey, we need to help more people understand what Corsha is really doing, this new kind of category of identity and access management for APIs that's different than traditional API security. What's the biggest focus from a technology standpoint? I mean, from everything we've talked about, it sounds like a very robust solution. It sounds like there was a ton of technical R&D that went into the solution that you've created. But I have to imagine as well that there's more features that are always going to be added into the platform. So what does that look like?
Yeah, and I will tip my hat to my co-founder, who is our CTO, Anusha Iyer, and she's brilliant actually, and has done very well at giving us a product that can be sold. So, people often ask us, well, blockchain, isn't that going to be slow? Is it going to keep up with the API traffic? And the answer is a lot of work has gone into performance and scale. And so that's one of the places where we will always continue to grow. But we have a really good story around that right now. Some of the other features that are important to us that we have now, but we need to expand are, let's go back to the idea of the clone. Somebody steals it and you have a problem. Somebody's trying to replicate your thing and you see a collision. What do you do about it? Well, part of our capabilities that we have now that, again, we'll expand is we can see those collisions, but we also have the ability to actually turn off the access for any individual API client just through a central management console. So we are now working to integrate with systems like Splunk, for example, or alerts or SIEMs, where they see some idea of a problem. They see it's traffic analysis, or they have some heuristic reason why they think there's a problem. Then they can either programmatically or manually turn to Corsha and say, turn that one off. You can turn it off. Now we fix it, and we can actually turn it right back on from using the same process by just enabling the API access. So that's one. Right now, we would partner with those who do some of those analytics. There's a roadmap that has us bring some of those analytics directly into Corsha. There's also part of our roadmap is, authorization, which is different than authentication. Authentication means that's you, I know it's you, okay, you have access. Now, authorization is what can I do inside the network once I'm let in? And that today for APIs is what's in the secrets that we've been talking about, the credentials,
Right.
that's what you're managing. And certainly there's a play for us to pull authorization into our MFA credential. So it may be that at some point you don't need that primary static value either, but all that's on the roadmap. And then finally, we do API traffic today, but there are a lot of different protocols that are different than just HTTP and HTTPS, and we're actually finding a way to bring new protocols on rapidly, but we'll continue to expand those into, different kinds of ecosystems.
Interesting. Yeah, I was expecting like maybe one big feature or maybe a couple of smaller ones, but that sounds like 5 different potential like massive changes in terms of how the platform is used within these organizations. So it sounds like there's just a ton of, again, potential for how this platform grows in utility for some of these folks. So awesome. Well, I'm excited to follow along. Ceremonial last question for you. Are you currently looking for investment or hiring? You just raised your Series A, so probably not on the investment side. I'm sure you're looking for hiring, but let me throw it over to you.
Great question. Thank you for the softball. Absolutely, we're hiring.
Yeah,
we've got money to spend. Having just we're literally a matter of a handful of weeks actually out from the round, but we are growing rapidly. We were a pretty small team when we raised our A. And we actually are planning to have doubled the size of the company between A and June 30, and we have more to come. And we're hiring across functionality in the company: technical, customer focused, certainly go to market, sales and marketing. So yeah, please hit me up. We have openings.
Yeah. It sounds like just about anyone who's interested, there'll be a role for you. Awesome. Well, again, thanks so much for the time, Chris. I think you did a great job of distilling this into a much more digestible concept. And I certainly feel like I have a better grasp on what this new form of API security looks like. And I'm sure many of the listeners do as well.
Thanks, Kyle. I really appreciate the invite. It's been great to chat.